Now I'm going to speak about medicine and physicians in slave labor camps. In the Radom district, I will speak about 2 camps, and now I will start. I assume that everybody hears me, and I don't need a microphone. Various publications on medicines, okay. Various publications on medicine and physicians in numerous ghettos indicate that in response to the deplorable living conditions in the ghettos, in each ghetto, the heads of the Judenrat established a health services system intended to cope with epidemics and disease, provide care for the sick, and maintain the health of the ghetto's populace. Consequently, in every ghetto, there were health and sanitation departments headed by physicians and health specialists who established hospitals, clinics, and first aid points. From March 42 onward, once the implementation of the final solution and with it the liquidation of the ghettos throughout the Polish general government territory began, the arms and ammunition factories were at risk of marked lack of workers. In the summer of 1942, Reich Minister of Armament and War Production Albert Speer and SS Chef Heinrich Himmler decided to keep a few tens of thousands of Jews alive as inmates in slave labor camps for Jews, dubbed by the SS Zwangsarbeitslager für Juden. Such labor camps were built in the compounds of the arms and ammunition factories founded by the Poles in the Radom province between the 2 world wars and used to produce guns, bullets, tank parts, explosives, steel, iron, etc. With the outbreak of the war, these factories were bought by German and Austrian industrialists. Once the decision to use Jews as part of the workforce was reached, barracks intended to house the slave laborers were built nearby, and Jews who had passed the selection and been found fit for work were sent there. Testimonies indicate that unlike the ghettos, where hospitals and clinics were a Judenrat initiative, in these slave labor camps it was the SS staff in charge of the Jewish prisoners who arranged for the establishment of hospitals and clinics. The study of medicine and physician in the slave labor camps had attracted very little scholarly attention in Poland. I'm speaking about Poland. The issue is mentioned in passing in survivors' testimonies and in the memoirs written by Jewish doctors who, after working as physicians in ghettos, went on to serve as physicians when they too were incarcerated in labor camps. In most cases, the information is meager and seems to be subject to the memory experience of the survivors, some of whom were prisoners who fell ill and were hospitalized in the camp, while others were part of the medical staff, such as physicians, nurses, orderlies, and additional auxiliary workers. In the time allocated to this lecture, I will address 2 slaver camps in the Radom district in Poland, where the medical treatment of prisoners is described in the testimonies and memoirs of Jewish physicians and prisoners alike. The first camp I will discuss was established in the city of Częstochowa in western Poland. In September-October 42, the few thousands of Jews left in the city after the main part of Jewish population had been deported to Treblinka death camps. About 30,000 were deported to Treblinka. About 7,000 remained in the ghetto, something like Radom. In Radom, 30,000 deported and 4,500 in the slave labor camps in Radom were divided. Those who remained, the 7,000, were divided between several local plants owned by the Hasag company, a German company, which now became camps for Jewish slave laborers. The largest and most prominent among these was the Pelzeri ammunition factory, whose Jewish slave laborers numbered more than 4,000. Among the camp's inmates were several Jewish physicians, nurses, both male and female, orderlies, and other auxiliary staff, who were all assigned to a separate check that served as their living quarters. The camp's hospital was located in a corner of one of the factory's halls and comprised 2 separate rooms for men and women, as well as a clinic. The sick rooms contained 10 wooden bunks and basic equipment. Dr. Sperling, a Vienna-trained surgeon, was appointed head of the medical staff. His relations with the various department heads of the factory were quite good, presumably due to his personality. Due to command of the German language, he won the trust of the SS to the extent, and when the camp's German personnel required medical attention, they turned to him rather than seek the help of German military physicians. The rest of the Jewish physicians, internists, and dentists also treated the German personnel. The camp's clinic and hospital had a high patient load, and the entire staff worked 24 hours a day in shifts. Physicians looked after Jews wounded during the deportation prior to Treblinka, as well as work-related injuries in the factory's department. Medical care consisted of dressing wounds, distribution of medications, and simple operations. From the material we have, we know that one female patient arrived at the hospital suffering from a case of appendicitis. Dr. Sperling operated on her using minimum amounts of anesthetics, and she recovered. In a testimony given by another female survivor, was indicated that although the clinic contained several beds, hospitalized patients were not allowed to occupy a bed for more than 3 days. A lengthy stay at the hospital or in the clinic was dangerous, since a grave illness which made a patient unfit for work could have meant a death sentence. In another testimony, the survivor explained that normal procedure required an inmate who became ill to approach his foreman, who would give the inmate a pass to go to the clinic. I quote, "Later, the patient had to provide a note from the doctor that he has actually been there in the clinic, what was the diagnosis, and whether he needed hospitalization." End of quote. The testimonies indicate that apparently many sick inmates preferred to avoid hospitalization. Although decisive and controlling by nature, characteristics which the German found essential for his position, Dr. Sperling was also endowed with excellent organization skills. The inmates knew he had a supply of medications, some brought over from the ghetto pharmacy after the deportations, others sent by the Jüdische Sozialhilfe, the self-help organization headed by Dr. Michael Weichart in Krakow. This organization, formed on the outbreak of the war, used donations sent to Poland from abroad to supply medicines and medical equipment, among other things. Indeed, the Pelzeri camp in Częstochowa had a plentiful supply of analgesics. As a preventative measure against the epidemics, the camp had a cleaning squad, Reinigungskommando, and in each barrack, an inmate was put in charge of cleaning. Despite these efforts, in the autumn of 43, a typhoid fever epidemic spread through the inmates' barracks. Once this was discovered, Dr. Sperling, along with the other doctors, attempted to hide it from the SS, and together with the nurses and orderlies, looked after the patients selflessly and devotedly. It seems that the care given in this camp to ill inmates was quite effective, and monthly mortality due to disease in this camp was no more than a dozen inmates. Reuven Monovich, a survivor, later testified the following, I quote, "The hospital in the camp was exceptionally well organized. For example, in 1944, we had no bandages, so instead we were given rolls of 10-centimeter white crepe paper, which we cut in half and used as bandages, end of quote. Occasionally, the hospital received aid from the Red Cross in Geneva. One inmate recounts in his memoirs that the German commandant of the Pelzeri camp sent him to deliver to Dr. Sperling a quarter of the contents of an aid package sent from Geneva. The same survivor also told how, when he himself was injured at work one day, he had to undergo an operation in the clinic. The second slave labor camp I'd like to discuss is Blizhin, established by the SS in early 42 in a small village located some 50 kilometers from Radom. At the beginning, the camp population consisted of some 8,000 Soviet prisoners of war, and a year later, after it was decided to get rid of them, the drinking water in the camp was poisoned, and shortly afterwards, all of them were dead. In March 43, once the POW's corpse had been removed, the place became a slave labor camp for Jews, and within a few months it housed some 4,500 Jewish inmates who had passed the selection in several ghettos in the vicinity and were not sent to Treblinka. Among the most prominent characteristics of Blizhin slave labor camp were hideously hygienic conditions and a marked lack of basic sanitation, not least because the camp had not been disinfected prior to the arrival of the Jewish inmates. In late September 43, 30 Jewish children and dozens of boys and girls aged below 16 were infected with scarlet fever. Dr. Weinepo, his memoirs were published in English. The name of his book is From Death Row to Freedom. It was published in 1984. Who had arrived from the Radom ghetto to Blizhin as early as March 43, was moved to one of the 4 stone-built houses in the compound, which he was supposed to convert to a clinic, to an operating room, and to a room for emergency first aid. Initially, at that time, there were, beside Weinepo, 2 more physicians in the camp, a surgeon and an internist, as well as a healer, a feldsher. In the fall of 1943, the medical staff was expanded with the arrival of 3 surgeons, 3 internists, a few nurses, and 1 paramedic, all Bialystok Jews who arrived in a transport from Majdanek. It was September 43. The stone structure which housed Dr. Weinepo became a hospital of sorts, where 200 to 300 inmates were hospitalized regularly. The patients lay in 3 tiers, one at floor level, the second on a low wall-to-wall bunk, and the third group on a second bunk built about 1.5 meters above the lower one. One of the Blizhin inmates later recounted in his testimony that 3 months after his arrival, his hand became severely infected and that he recovered after Dr. Milstein, a surgeon, assisted by Dr. Pekin, operated on his hand in the clinic under general anesthesia. In January 1944, a typhoid epidemic spread throughout the camp. Its source was the contaminated uniforms of the Soviet POWs and German personnel serving in the camp. I quote, "Even antipyretic drugs are unavailable. Nothing. One simply goes to work and falls down," end of quote. The epidemic reached its peak in February 1944 with some 1,300 sick inmates. Some of them were quarantined in a separate shack, where male and female patients lay in bunks beyond hope of recovery. I quote, "The doctor asked us to stick out our tongue. That was the medical examination. No treatment, no drugs, nothing," end of quote. Besides the quarantined patients, some of the typhoid victims were hospitalized in the camp's hospital, where the Jewish doctors looked after them selflessly, even when they themselves became ill. Weiner Pale writes in his memoirs, I quote, "Fearing that news of the epidemic would bring about the liquidation of the camp, the Jewish doctors did not inform the camp's SS commandant that it was a typhoid epidemic, and instead reported diseases such as pneumonia, arthritis, and general weakness among the prisoners," end of quote. One of the most interesting things emerging from the testimonies is that on one hand, there were no drugs available in the camp, yet on the other hand, surprisingly enough, several physicians in the camp did have medications at their disposal and treated well of inmates who could pay for medical care. In his testimony given immediately after the war, Yoshua Margolis tells how a physician who took him for a person of means approached him in the sick barracks, I quote, with a business proposal. In return for gold coins and dollar bills, he would inject me with medication that would ensure I'd recover. Unfortunately, I did not have the means, and he abandoned me to my fate, end of quote. Moshe Emanuel, a child who contracted typhoid fever and received effective medical treatment, recounts in his experience, I quote, "My parents brought some doctor, a prisoner, whom they must have paid, and he treated me. I also had dysentery. The doctor gave me a transfusion of my father's blood, and I do not remember which medications I swallowed. I was on the verge of death," end of quote. A while later, Emmanuel's father too became ill, and Moshe and his sister brought the same physician to treat him with injections. I quote, "I say to him, 'Doctor, I have a box made of gold which I will give you if my father recovers.' The doctor sat by his bedside, nursed him, and my father recovered." When I interviewed some 3-4 years ago Yitzhak Reichenbaum, who was 11 years old when he was incarcerated in the camp, he told me that his brother contracted polio, his mother became pregnant, and he himself contracted typhoid fever. The Reichenbaums were among the camp's elite, and Jewish doctors who worked clandestinely in the camp performed an abortion on his mother, treated him and his brother, and all unbeknownst to the Germans. By the way, all the family survived. The parents with their 2 boys. In February, a minute. In February 44, the camp, what?
One of the lecturer canceled, she didn't came, so
I will answer questions. I know, I understand. I want professorship because I know some English. In February 44, the camp commandant decided to let all sick inmates remain in their barracks and did not permit the SS men to kill any of those who were sick. Again, and did not permit the SS to kill any of those who were sick. Work in the hospital continued, and the physicians had no choice but to ask the Germans for large quantities of medication, since many of the patients who recovered from typhoid fever remained in the sheds and still had diarrhea and high fever. In the summer of 44, all the inmates in Blizhin were deported to Auschwitz. It was in all the forced labor camps in the Radom district. In the summer of 44, when the Soviets were on the border of Radom, all the inmates were deported to Auschwitz. In conclusion, the above description raises the question: what motivated the SS to establish hospitals and clinics in slave labor camps and staff them with physicians and medical personnel for treating Jewish prisoners whose doom had already been sealed in 1941-1942? The answer lies in the fact that as long as Jewish prisoners worked at manufacturing arms, textile, and ammunition, the lifeblood of the German army in the second phase of the war, when the likelihood of Nazi Germany's defeat was growing, there was no purpose to annihilate them. On the contrary, they were needed alive as essential slave labor, and their health and fitness for work had to be preserved. Indeed, Jewish physicians and other medical personnel kept on working as medical staff both in Auschwitz and after the death marches, and even until the liberation, and a large number of them survived. Their testimonies provide scholars and researchers a highly significant source of information on a little studied field, Holocaust studies. Thank you very much.